Welcome back to another episode of Principles of Micro. We're in Chapter 13, learning about oligopolies. We learned earlier what oligopolies were. We had some definitions and examples. We saw that game theory applied to oligopolies, particularly the prisoner's dilemma. So now we'll look at what is the role for government intervention and regulation in markets when there are oligopolies. So we established that firms would often like to set a high price and get monopolist profits to just split that among themselves. We know monopolies are bad for society in general. We saw that they produce a quantity that's going to be lower than the efficient amount, and they're going to charge a very high price that's going to harm consumer welfare and also create deadweight loss. So while oligopolies would like to achieve that outcome, they're often thwarted by prisoner's dilemma style situations. So while cooperating and charging the high price might be the best outcome for their profits, their individual incentives are charged a low price. Often the low price can be the dominant strategy. So that can prevent oligopolies from doing these monopoly type outcomes and monopoly style pricing. However, we also saw that if a game gets repeated, then cooperation might occur even in a prisoner's dilemma situation. That's because the game gets repeated, you can reward cooperation by cooperating later and punish a lack of cooperation by being uncooperative later in the game. However, if the game is played once and only once, there is no later in the game. So no opportunity to reward cooperation, no opportunity to punish lack of cooperation. So repetition can, but doesn't always give you cooperation. So because of this risk of cooperation, this risk of setting monopolist style prices, there is a role for the government to set some regulation and intervene in the markets to avoid this large welfare losses that occur when you have monopolies. So one landmark in regulation of oligopolies was the Sherman Antitrust Act, passed way back in 1890. That stopped firms from colluding with each other. Prior to that act passing, the firms could set explicit contracts. They could talk to each other about setting price and quantity, and they could agree to, I'm going to charge this price and you're going to charge that price. So they could basically agree on a monopolist outcome and just divide the monopolist profits among themselves. And that was not very good for the economy. If the firms could have these binding contracts, that's going to avoid the prisoner's dilemma entirely. So imagine a situation again where the prisoners really could commit to not confessing. Just have a binding contract saying they're both not going to confess. Then you're going to avoid that issue we saw earlier where they both end up not cooperating. So that was an important piece of legislation. Another important law that your book mentions is the Clayton Act of 1914. It didn't ban all four of these things, rather it just restricted them. So what they got restricted is something called price discrimination. We did our chapters a little bit out of order, so we'll learn more about that later on in this course. Some forms of price discrimination do remain legal. We'll have some actual examples of that in Chapter 11, but again, more on that later. It also prevents what your book calls exclusive dealings. So some ways firms are trying to prevent their customers from buying from other firms, trying to force them to keep buying from your firm only. So here's a possible example. I say possible, I put a question mark here because this is still being disputed. So over in the European Union, the regulators have said that Google is engaging in exclusive dealings. So they're saying that Google's search results are prioritizing its own products over the products of competing companies. So the courts found this, they ruled against Google, but Google has been appealing and Google has been denying the charges. So we'll have to see what happens to that appeal to see if this really is an example or not of an exclusive dealing. So the jury is still out on that one. Another thing that was banned, or not banned, but restricted in the Clayton Act was what your book calls tying arrangements. That's when they're forcing you to buy one product in order to buy a second product. That's also a form of price discrimination. We'll learn more about that in Chapter 11. I believe it's called bundling, but we'll hear more about that later. Lastly, the Clayton Act restricted mergers and acquisitions. So a merger is where two firms are going to join together. An acquisition is when one firm is going to buy out the stocks in another firm and take over ownership. Either way, though, it's going to reduce the number of firms in the market, and that's going to reduce the amount of competition. Now, mergers can still happen, but for large firms, they do have to be approved by regulators first. So why would regulators ever allow any mergers to happen? Well, there are some valid reasons. We saw earlier in our chapter on monopolies that for some industries there can be economies of scale. That is, long-run average total costs decrease when quantity rises. One example was with electricity. It's very expensive to set up your own electric grid. Once you've done that, though, providing power to one additional customer, that is your marginal cost, is very, very low. So it's efficient to let there be one giant firm providing all the electricity, and then you spread that big fixed cost of set up the grid across a vast number of customers. And that's just lower cost overall. So there can be some valid reasons for allowing a merger to happen, but regulators are rightly skeptical because they also know that mergers can make things less competitive. There's also laws restricting what's called dumping. Your book calls it predatory pricing. Here's the idea that they're trying to outlaw. So let's say you have a couple of firms in a market, and one firm has more cash on hand than its rival does. That firm might then cut its prices dramatically, even run a loss. They're selling goods at a price that's lower than the marginal cost of making them. And what they're going to do is they're making a loss, but their rival is also making a loss. They're figuring, our rival's going to run out of money before we do, so they'll go out of business, but we'll survive. Once you've successfully driven your rival out of business, what you can then do is jack up the price because now you're a monopolist. So one non-example that your book talks about is Walmart. I'll talk about it specifically in Kirksville, Missouri, where I lived for 4 years. So Kirksville is a very, very small town in rural northeastern Missouri. Population there is only 17,000. There used to be a lot of small firms there that were making goods that customers were buying, but then Walmart came to town. Walmart is famous for its low prices, so it drove those other firms out of business. Now, importantly though, once Walmart got rid of the competition, they kept their prices low. So they were not engaging in dumping. If instead Walmart had been running losses during that time, and I don't think they were, but if they've been running losses at that time, and then they adjusted prices later to make monopolist profits, that would be predatory pricing, but they did not do that. So this is not an example of dumping. So for welfare, customers would benefit in the short run while this price war is happening, while the firms are trying to undercut each other in price. In the long run, though, the monopoly is going to reduce social welfare. So there is a rationale for regulating dumping. That being said, anti-dumping laws are a bit controversial among economists. That's because, in practice, politicians often abuse them in the name of restricting trade. We saw earlier that trade creates value, and that is pretty well established and a consensus belief among economists. Now, it often turns out that a country has a comparative advantage in a certain good. So if they have a comparative advantage in that good, they can undercut your country's firms on price, and they can make a profit by doing so and put your firms out of business. That's not necessarily dumping, though. It could just mean they have a comparative advantage. They're more efficient at making that particular good than your country is. So it could be efficient to allow your firms to die in that industry and you rely upon imports. On the other hand, you focus on your strengths where you have a comparative advantage and you export goods there, and that's more efficient for everyone overall. Politicians, though, often cave into lobbying from domestic firms and corporate interests, so they abuse anti-dumping laws to try to restrict free trade, and that leads to inefficiency. So do the gains of banning some generally predatory pricing outweigh the cost of this abuse in international trade? That's disputed, so there's not a consensus on whether anti-dumping laws are a good idea or not among economists. So that wraps up oligopolies and regulation. Now I'll move on to look at network externalities. So a network externality occurs when demand for a good increases when more people have already purchased the good. So I'll give you some examples first before we talk more about it. Phones have network externalities. I'm trying to imagine, how do phones ever get started? If you're the first person to own a phone in the world, that was of absolutely no benefit to you. If nobody else has a phone, you can't call anyone, and back before we had smartphones, the whole point of having a phone was to call people. So I'm not sure how they convinced the first people to buy phones. But once they did, and once phones became widespread, then they became quite useful. Now just about everyone has a phone. You can call just about anyone you know, and that's very convenient. Therefore, phones become more desirable the more widespread they are. Social networking websites are also an example of network externalities. So a big one out there today is Facebook. You guys might recall that a couple years ago, Google tried to compete with Facebook. They tried their own social networking site called Google+. It never really caught on. That's because of the large network externality. If you're the first person to join Google+, then no one else is there, none of your friends are there. There's no point in being a social networking site if there's no one to socialize with. So hardly anyone I knew tried Google+, so I never had an attempt at all to switch to Google+, and I never did it. And the effort to compete with Facebook just died. So why is the name network externality? Recall what an externality is back from our previous chapters. So we define it as follows. It's a cost or benefit that affects a third party in ways outside the market mechanism. Our classic example was pollution. So when pollution occurs, it affects third parties, it affects other people. There is no market for pollution, so that fits our definition very, very cleanly. So why this applies to things like phones and social networking? Well, if someone else buys a phone, that affects not just them and not just the phone company, it also affects people who already own phones. So that's an externality. So it's a network because it's based on the network of people who already own phones. So hence the name network externalities. Facebook is also similar. So when people join Facebook, that's going to affect people who've already been on Facebook. They have more people to connect with, more of their friends are on that social networking site. So that's also an externality. So when network externalities are present, that's going to naturally lead to oligopolies and even lead to monopolies. So Facebook is a near monopoly, and that's because of network externalities. Trying to start competition with Google Plus just isn't going to work. And also with telecoms, with phones, there's only a handful of major companies out there. At one point, there was one giant firm, I think it was AT&T, and AT&T got broken up into smaller firms. So some industries by their nature have network externalities, and that can naturally lead to monopolies or oligopolies. And at that point, there can be a role for government regulation to intervene in the market. So that wraps up Chapter 13 on oligopolies. If you have any questions about the material, go ahead and leave a comment below, and I'll try to answer your questions. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you guys next time for our next chapter.